I wanted to talk a little bit today about doing a gauge swatch. It's important to calculate your foot length if you're going to make a sock that fits. In order to do that, you need to know what gauge you're knitting at. That is, how many rows per inch and how many stitches per inch you're getting in your gauge, in your sample. On my machine right now, I have a 72 slot cylinder. So I'm going to be knitting at 72 stitches per inch. I want to be able to make socks that fit both men and women, narrow and wide feet, to a certain range on this cylinder. Right here is my V-cam. It's shaped like a V. It's a cam because it's movable. It goes up and down. And this is what I use to set my stitch length. You'll notice that the needles go down when they reach the cam. It takes the butt of the needles and it forces them down. By changing the screw on my machine, and your machine will be a little different, and your screw, your adjustment will be in a different place, but it will work the same. You may not see your cam, it may be hidden behind the outer shell, but you will have one. So what happens is if you put it down, if I screw it down, you can see that the cam is going down. That makes a longer stitch length. It's going to pull the needles down. It's going to draw the yarn down to make a longer stitch. If I raise it up, a little difficult to do with one hand. If I raise it up, think up tight, you will have a tighter stitch. What I've done is I've placed marks on mine so that I can see a little bit easier. Mine has a D-dent. That means there's a little dent, so it wants to sit in one spot. And if I turn it half a turn, again, it will sit in one spot. I've marked mine red and blue, so I know if I've gone a full turn or a half turn. For me, the red is my starting. So I start with the red facing me. I'll turn half a turn and then a full turn. So this is our starting point. One of the great places to start is to find out how deep of a stitch you can make. What is your longest stitch length? In order to do that, you need to screw it all the way down to the bottom. The longest stitch length you can make. And I can go one more. That's it. That's my longest stitch length. You'll notice that the V-cam came down quite a bit. I do have marks on mine, but I choose not to use them because it's pretty difficult for me to bend over when I'm on the machine and to see those marks. One way you can do it is to find the furthest down you'll go. This is where I painted mine red and call that your starting point. You can always count up. You can go half a turn, one turn, half a turn, two turns. So you could call this point 2 turns on your machine. Another way is to measure. There's different places you could measure. I use a caliper. They're not very expensive and they're accurate enough for what I need to do. You can measure in a number of different places. I like to measure from the bottom of the V-cam to the top of the cylinder. I always place my adjustment screw right across from my center mark on the cylinder. It's important to measure it in the same place every time. Your cylinder may not sit completely flat, but if you always measure in the same spot, you will get an accurate measurement. What I do is I go over from my red mark 1, 2 fins. Even if I had a 60 cylinder, I will measure over 2 fins. It's just the way I do it, and it allows me to be consistent. So I go 1, 2, I push down, and you'll see that there is a pin that comes out, and that will go from the top of the cylinder to the bottom, and then I read my measurement. That would be 8.65 millimeters. Oops, no it's not. I center it, I make sure it's 0, and now I will take my measurement. .99 millimeters. You can measure to the nearest ½ millimeter, so I would call that 29 millimeters. So what I would do is I would record that on a notebook. I know that I have 2 full turns because we counted them, and also 28.9 or 29 millimeters. So I have 2 different measurements that I can use to get that exact same stitch length. You don't always have to measure from that one spot. Some people prefer to measure from the bottom here to the base. It doesn't matter if you measure from there or to the bottom to the top of your screw, as long as you're consistent. So then what I've done is I knit a tube, and I knit it starting at one of the lowest settings, and I turned my knob 1 full turn. Then I knit a few more rows. I kept doing that until I got my tension so tight that I couldn't lift anymore. What happens is when you get to the top, you will be limited because the butts, when you raise them to do the heel, at some point the butts are going to come in contact with the top of your V-cam. If you raise your V-cam enough, if it's too high, you won't even be able to get past the butt. And I've reached that point. If you look carefully, you'll see that the edge of the cam is now hitting my needle butt. So that is definitely too tight. So I will never be able to knit at that tension. So I can lower my V-cam. And again, I can't knit at this tension because the needle butt is interfering with the top of my cam. Oh, there it is. So now I have clearance. No, apparently I don't. So that again is too high. You will find the optimum setting for the tightest tension. And it's not just the V-cam that will limit you. You will also run into the problem with the stitches being tight. When the stitches on the yarn are too tight, the needles won't be able to pull up and down through them. Your stitches will rise up on the needles and you won't have enough weight to be able to pull them down. Then you've exceeded the stitch limit for that particular yarn. So what I've done is I actually made a tube. Here is my sample tube. So if you look at it, it's actually quite wide at the bottom and quite narrow at the top. So I started 1 full turn in. I knew that I would never use for myself the widest setting. What I should have done was made 2 identical tubes, 1 to wash and 1 not to wash. You really would have seen the difference. Each section, when I first did it, was over 2 inches. However, now that it's been washed and dried, if you look at this first section, it's nowhere close to 2. I put a little row of white crocheting cotton in between each setting, so that way I knew where I changed my settings. I did make notes, so I had all of that information. So this area, once I washed it and dried it, it shrunk enough that it's not even 2 inches anymore. So that's why it's important to always wash, dry, and then press your gauge. It's going to be quite wrinkled, and when you press it, I didn't stretch it, I just laid the iron on it with a little bit of steam to press it flat. So that is how your sock is going to be after it's washed and dried. Now if you look at this tube, this was all knit on the 72 cylinder. My widest stitch tension, I've got 6 inches across. So because it's a tube, there's 2 sides, it's actually going to be 12 inches in diameter. This was one of my lower settings. way up here at the top, this little section here, I did not knit 2 inches because it was too tight. I could not get it to knit. It was dropping stitches. It was definitely way too tight for my machine. I did a little bit, and then I just said, that's it. I'm never going to use this tension on this yarn. It just didn't knit practically very well. But if you look at the very top, the difference is astounding. So if you're down here, we've got 6 inches, which makes it 12 inches in diameter. But way up here at the tighter settings, you've only got about 4 inches, which is 8 inches in diameter. So you've got 4-inch difference between the top and the bottom of the tube. I'll bend it over so you can actually, or I'll fold it back over, so you can see the difference. That's quite a difference in diameter. This is the same tube, the same type of yarn. It's Opal 4-ply. So it's quite astounding the difference that just changing your tension makes. When you find a tension that you like, that you're happy with, then that's the one you'll want to use on your machine. Ideally, you want to take the very tightest tension where it starts to raise up. In fact, that was here for me. I could knit on this, but if I had to engage the heel spring, it would have made the tension too tight, and then I wouldn't have been able to get nice stitches without having them drop. So I want to go down 1, and this is the tension. This is the tightest tension I would want to use. And it's actually approximately 11 rows per inch. It's a nice fabric. It has nice stretch to it. It feels nice. These ones are very stiff. This one up top doesn't feel comfortable. It is very hard, very stiff. There won't be a lot of stretch. If there isn't a lot of stretch, you won't be able to get air through, and your socks really won't breathe. So you do need a little bit of airflow in order for your socks to breathe and to function properly. So thank you very much for your time. This is my test tube. Please, everybody, I encourage you to make your own test tube. You'd be amazed to see the difference. I used scrap yarn. I made my tube. I washed it and dried it, took my measurements, and now I know how to get the same settings on my machine because I took very careful notes. And I know how many turns I did for this particular fabric right here, and I'll be able to replicate it. Once I know how many rows per inch I have, then I can calculate how long to make my sock.